Good afternoon. My name is Karen Jackson. I am the interim executive director at the New College Institute in Martinsville, Virginia. We're a proud sponsor of the Smart Cities Week Global 2020. I'm excited to be here today with Dr. John Kelly, the founder and CEO of Graphika, to discuss cyber social fabric of cities. Dr. Kelly, over to you.
Thanks. I'm so grateful for the chance to speak with you today. It's hopefully going to be fun and informative. That's the objective here. So my talk is called the cyber social fabric of cities, and that's a big word, cyber social. So let's dive into trying to understand what we mean by that and how it applies to cities and big data and all that sort of stuff. So at Graphika, we like to call ourselves cartographers of cyber social terrain. So to unpack that idea a little bit, think about how humanity has evolved in geoterrain, physical space, continents and locations and rivers and bodies of water, etc. And for thousands of years, humanity has evolved in geoterrain, and all human collective action, whether it's markets or states or warfare or trade, anything, is created by human communications. So, and that communication for the evolution of humanity has been at the speed of a messenger on foot or a boat, on the water, or maybe someone running if it was an important message. But we don't necessarily live in that world anymore, as we'll get to. People often ask why we're called Graphika. So it's an homage to this guy, Eratosthenes, who was the head of the Great Museum of Alexandria in about 300 BC. The more famous Library of Alexandria was just a department of the museum. So the foremost scholar of his time in 300 BC, well known for having discovered the circumference or calculated the circumference of the Earth to within 3% of its modern known value back then, a pretty impressive feat. But less well known as the father of the field of geography, the idea that you could put down grid lines and with mathematical precision measure geoterrain. And so we named the company an homage to him because we measure something a little bit different. This is a map of showing the telegraph lines under the oceans and across continents in 1910. So a critical moment in the evolution of humanity was the invention of the telegraph, and that allowed us to punch a wormhole through geoterrain and communicate at planetary scale in real time. And this radically transformed human society, whether it's the way news flowed at an international level, or markets ran, or warfare was conducted, or the British Empire controlled its territories on the other side of the planet. Everything changed with this, and yet now we live in this world where that real-time planetary scale communications happen on these little things, and we're all carrying them around. And so human collective activity, which used to happen with communications in a geospace, now principally happens in what we call cyber social space. And that cyber social fabric, which is made up of all these, conditioned by all these little connections we make based on who we follow and who we friend and, what YouTube video we watch. All of these things condition algorithms and make connections between people and organizations, and that condition how we are organized, and how information flows, and how influence happens, and identity is constructed, and everything about the way humanity operates now is happening almost more in cyber social space than it is in geospace. So that's what we mean by cyber social terrain. And what we do at Graphika is map out that terrain. So we have a technology platform that looks at this fabric of connections and understands the shape of these communities, uses machine learning to segment these complex networks up to discover the communities within them, and then a lot of metrics of kind of who and what makes it tick. So that's what we mean when we say we're geographers of cyber social terrain. And then we use this for a variety of ways, things for customers, helping them understand their audience, helping them identify the right influencers and places to help, target their messaging, understand the impact that they and their campaigns are having in the world. And we do a lot of stuff around crises where, getting ahead of the crises, understanding how and if you need to respond to it. But I don't want that to be a sales pitch, but just to help you understand a little bit about where I'm coming from and kind of how we apply this technology to the kinds of things that you might care about in your work. So I want to kind of pivot out and lay down some kind of foundational ideas about cyber social fabric and why it's important and how it intersects with call it real life things like cities. So what we're looking at here is a diagram of what I call social scale. So that kind of red stick figure over there on the left, that's you. And you're surrounded by your 6 best friends, you know, plus or minus 2 that everyone has, you know, the people you really, really trust and are close to. Roughly 30 wider network of people you interact with on a regular basis that, you know, your trusted relationships. Then you kind of go a little bit further out on the onion and you get to this magical number of 150. Some people call it the Dunbar number, after a Scottish paleo primatologist who understood the relationship between different primates and their brain size and their group size and how much time they spent grooming each other. But what he discovered is that for humans, 150 is kind of the magic number of how many people you can track reputationally. Like if you give them $5, you're likely to get it back. And this ends up having a lot of really interesting properties. You know, the size of a village you can have before you need a police officer, you know, for instance. Then you go another layer out on the onion, you get to, you know, kind of the scale of several thousand, which is about how many names you can put to a face, you know, kind of how many human beings, specific human beings you can know of and track. And then beyond that, you get out to what Benedict Anderson called the imagined communities. And these are actually the communities that are often most important to us, like our city or our country, our nation, our religion. These very, very large groups of people that we feel ourselves to be one of, and our identity is constructed to be one of them. There are values. We might grab a gun and jump in a trench to defend them with our very lives, but these are people we've never met. And these communities are kind of narratively constructed based on mass media and education and all these different ways that we come to be who we are. And across social scale, all of these different levels are maintained through communications, you know, from interpersonal communications over there on the small scale out to originally kind of until the 21st century, mass communications, television, radio on the kind of scale of imagined communities, and then different things in between. And the internet has completely changed all of this in ways that I think we're still coming to grips with. You know, your 6 best friends could be in any part of the world instead of, you know, in your neighborhood. And your imagined community is no longer, you know, what it believes about itself is no longer gatekeepered by powerful institutions like television channels and newspapers. Rather, you know, you're being woven into that with these things. And that has profound implications as we're going to talk about. So 21st century communications have radically changed how humanity is organized across all levels of social scale in ways we need to understand. So let's now turn it to looking at cities, which is our kind of the topic of this conference and what we're interested in here. So cities, in addition to kind of, you know, a geo-terrain and kind of the map of the streets and where the buildings are, has a cyber-social terrain too. So people in a city are connected in meaningful ways, you know, based on what they do on these things, and in ways that are kind of locally relevant as well as internationally or nationally relevant. And these networks form among real people, again, based on these choices they make about who to connect with and interact with. That forms structured communities. And in a city like Chicago, you've got sets of communities around everything from food and dining to tech, leisure and entertainment, African-American culture, sports, all this sort of stuff. Now, in our world at Graphika, you know, we're creating what we call maps, as cartographers do. And I just wanted to kind of, because we're going to see more of these things, talk you through just what you're looking at here, so it's not confusing. So this is the cyber-social landscape of Chicago, Illinois. Every dot there is a social media account of a Chicagoan or someone physically in Chicago when we kind of put the geofence around it and pulled the sample. And then the 2 dots being close together means that they're likely to be connected. So imagine there's a little spring or force of gravity that whenever an account follows another one, it pulls them closer together. So what you're seeing here in the position of the dots is where the communities are. You know, what are the sets of folks that are all interconnected, and what one of them does, the others see. As someone on the other side of the map, what someone over here does is probably not visible to them. And then the color is another critical thing where we're using machine learning to analyze the patterns of relationships and to cluster this network into different meaningful groupings. Typically, a Graphika map has somewhere between 40 and 60, even 80 individual clusters, which roll up into these groupings that you see here as a color. So, there are actually several shades of blue there in the African American culture grouping. You're going to see different shades of kind of beige in the youth culture segments, et cetera. Now, what's really interesting is the importance of this cybersocial fabric. So, we know about, community centers and bowling clubs and all this kind of traditional ways that local social capital was built. Now, a lot of this is happening through these cybersocial connectivity. So at the level of a city, this is how, digital solidarity can be built, how, the foodies get to know, which is the cool food truck that week. It's also how people share their local stories and their values and, what it is they'd like to see happen in their hometowns and their cities, and help to motivate different groups and kind of members of that society to get together and figure out what they want to do and how to connect and get it done. So cybersocial fabric in the 21st century is critical to the healthy life of a community. And it's a major way that people organize and do all kinds of good things. But as we all know, we're seeing the downside too, that there are risks that malicious actors who become good at manipulating this cybersocial fabric with deceptive behavior, deceptive content, often deceptive technology, the ability to run bot networks or kind of hire people to work in troll farms, the ability of manipulators to manipulate the otherwise organic, natural cybersocial fabric is really causing us a whole bunch of problems at the local and the national scale. So let's dive in and take a little bit of a look with some exemplars of actual American cities. So we've done cybersocial network maps of a number of cities across the country for a bunch of different use cases, everything from kind of marketing to, to sort of early warning on crises. And we're just going to take a look at a few here. So one thing that's really kind of interesting, having made dozens of these things, is that there's some things that are very similar. You almost always find. So kind of taking a look at Portland, Atlanta, and Chicago, these networks all look a little bit different, but there's certain common features that you find in just about every city. So there's always kind of local clusters around the food and drink scene. What are the cool restaurants, the craft breweries, all that kind of stuff. Very local, but this is important kind of across the country in any city. Sports, of course, everything from, if you've got a college team in town, pro sports team, sports is another thing that really brings community together online at the city level. And then, of course, music and entertainment. What's the music scene like? What's the art scene, the theater scene? All that kind of stuff is another thing that's like really, really common feature in these kind of municipal landscapes. But there's also a lot of difference. And even when you've got something that's the same, when you dive into a specific city, the clustering and kind of how those communities break down tell you something really important about that city and things that are really unique. So for Portland, Oregon, obviously a very foodie city. So you've got multiple clusters in the kind of food and drink scene, everything from like a whole cluster around food carts, like these kind of super cool little food cart scene they've got there, to sort of foodies that want to be in a restaurant with kind of a more of a high-end experience, and also brewing, a real kind of Portland brewery scene. So the kind of, specific culture of Portland really comes through when you get down to that level. If you go to Atlanta, Georgia and dive into the music scene, you've got, really rich texture of musical communities across Atlanta, Georgia, everything from kind of gospel and Christian music to kind of the hip hop scene, sort of classic rock, all kinds of stuff there. And can dive in and look at a city like Chicago, where you've got a lot of differentiation in the sports scene, even around professional sports, multiple communities that are oriented to pro sports influencers, as well as kind of sports media, all that kind of stuff. So you can tell just looking at the network map that sports is really important to Chicago. So just on a day-to-day basis, you can see how these cyber social networks are helping to tie cities together, both in ways that are common to every city, but ways that support and enhance and promote the unique culture of that city itself. Super interesting. But, we live in troubling times, and these cyber social networks often end up being involved in things that are a little more dangerous or crisis oriented, and offer the opportunity for bad actors to come in and manipulate stuff. So here we're going to just look at some examples of American cities at the height of the kind of initial phases of the George Floyd protests, where you had a lot of kind of legitimate protest activity, a lot of local interest, but a lot of intersection of that with kind of more troublesome flows of national and international narrative, including some things that were manipulated. So what you're looking at here are maps of the Denver and Minneapolis participants in a whole set of kind of hashtags and conversation elements at the height of the protests. And you can see that there are, in both cases, there are kind of more locally focused clusters, but there are also, you can see how these, for instance, say group in Denver, a strong cluster around kind of even international sort of, not just progressive, but kind of socialist stuff. You also have the sort of the more right-wing activity, particularly in Minneapolis. There's a whole set of clusters that are focused on kind of the Minneapolis alt-right and kind of far right. But you also have participation by other actors, but the point I'm trying to make here is to show that some of these clusters not only reflect local communities, but show how these local actors are hooked up to flows of information coming in from national scale and even international scale communities around politics and other kinds of stuff. So that provides a vector for information to flow in to the local context that may be good or may be bad. It's just something to note. But I wanted to show a specific example of how things happen at the local level that sometimes, bad information spreads, and just what the dynamics of that are, and how that's often an international phenomenon. The kind of disinformation about a local event and local confusion about that is something that's often kind of, whipsaws around the world in a way that builds its momentum that ends up having that local effect. So we're going to take a quick look at a case study around the DC blackout hashtag. If you recall, there was at the height of the protest a hashtag DC blackout with the story that there had been a blackout in DC, and different stories about the possible imposition of martial law and various kinds of misinformation or disinformation stories and just rumors that spread kind of under the heading or the belief that DC had experienced blackout, which it did not. What we're seeing in the middle there is the network that promoted the DC blackout hashtag, and that what we call the Death Star, that kind of big blob in the middle, are a bunch of followers of an anonymous account, You're Anon Central, which played a critical role in boosting this hashtag. So it was, not just something that fabric of natural connections between real people boosted, but a very dense core of followers of one account operating in a primarily automated way were responsible for a critical kind of part of the boost phase of this. And if we examine that timeline, it's really interesting because you see a sort of early period before the DC blackout hashtag where a new anonymous account, or a fairly recent anonymous account, You're Anon Central, built audience. And that audience included getting boosted from K-pop fans. So there's a huge number of K-pop fans in Asia that are super social media active. They've been responsible for a number of things trending in the world, which occasionally makes the news. And somehow they decided that this account was really cool and helped them build a much larger audience than they had before. It was all before the DC blackout hashtag. Then you had another story where the DC blackout hashtag, the rumor started. And this started with a few tweets, and then You're Anon Central camped onto it and sort of promoted it as though it were a real thing. And then you entered this boost phase. So you can see how the trend line goes way, way up. And then as it hits its peak, the anonymous account changes its mind. People have, hours have passed. It's now early in the morning. It's not 3 a.m. anymore. And people have realized that, in fact, DC did not have a blackout. But in that period of time, this thing trended and was huge and got national attention. It was one of the top items on Twitter, et cetera. And now you've got kind of Anon saying, well, actually, this wasn't real. and in a way kind of blaming the K-pop fans that we met earlier for this problem. So what's interesting here is this was actually not, we did a whole report on this. It was not a manipulated campaign. This isn't something that a malicious actor did on purpose. This was all these different actors kind of picking up and amplifying a rumor without checking it. And then the whole thing kind of spun out of control in a really interesting way. You can go to our website to find that report if you're interested in the story there. But the point is that there's a really chaotic system out there that without sort of proper attention and controls can spread all sorts of what look like local stories that echo around the world and have a local impact. So, you know, how do we protect against this sort of thing? You know, we've seen a bit of the danger here and have a sense of, you know, what the challenges are. You know, what can we do? Well, we often think about, you know, if you think back to kind of the early promise of the internet, why people thought it'd be a good thing for democracy and society, all those ideas revolved around true signals coming from real people. And what we've learned recently, unfortunately, is that bad actors or malicious actors can manipulate the internet in such a way that we're, you know, being impacted more by fake signals from fake people. And you know, this is not just, you know, the Russians doing it or the Iranians or the Chinese. You know, this is something that you've got PR firms that can be hired to do. You know, you've got clusters of fake fans of a movie that might try and get in there and sort of do a little bit of marketing boost for that film before the Golden Globes rolls around. These are all things that we've seen. So we believe that the first thing that we need to do is get a kind of consensus around you know, authenticity as what we want to see online, and make it inauthentic behavior, whether it's coming from a Hollywood marketer, a political consultant in DC, or the Russian government, sort of equally discouraged. And that, ironically, will have the effect of making it much harder for the, you know, the Russian government or other state actors to do it if we don't allow our own people to do it for money. Another thing that I think is really important that could have helped out a lot in that DC blackout case is that, you know, before you, or as an influencer, as a person, as an organization, you know, take something and amplify it or pass it on, evaluate it, you know, have a zero trust policy towards that, make sure that it's real before it goes out there. Just enough in the way that kind of network communications work and cascades work, enough of the nodes sort of saying, hey, wait a minute, before they just, you know, hit retweet, you know, would do a lot to kind of keep the forest fire from spreading, so to speak. So anyway, that's a lot of stuff that I put out there, and you know, hopefully it was interesting. I look forward to talking about it.
John, I think I'm speaking for most people, I think it's fascinating. I've heard you give this a couple of times now, and I mean, I've learned an immense amount about this. The one group that particularly seems to me that could be impacted by this would be first responders. I mean, if you're trying to control a situation, you know, even the DC blackout, you think about the trickle down effect of transportation and public safety. You know, can you talk a little bit about, you know, the aspects of public safety and what you've seen, what, you know, in the mapping that you've done, and how this could really have an impact positively and negatively on the first responders? I know when I was Secretary of Technology for Virginia, there's nothing like a good crisis to attract attention, right? And so you let one bad thing happen, and not only do people want to flock physically to see what's going on, they want to flock socially and online, you know, to see what the news is and what's going on. Can you speak to that a little bit about how all of that kind of figures together and how, you know, it works and what Graphika is doing in that space to help?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're kind of different layers to that. And there's some things that are kind of more immediate, like, you know, this hashtag is trending. Is it real? You know, is there really a blackout, or is there really a fire over there? You know, two things that are more systemic, you know, or things you need to kind of cultivate a capability for. You know, there's one of the, to people that study disinformation, kind of well-known cases of Western disinformation was something the Internet Research Agency did, an operation called Columbia Chemical, where they had cultivated a bunch of online assets or personas that looked like authoritative local news and other kind of authoritative local, you know, personas. And then they all in a big burst spread this story that a chemical plant in Louisiana had blown up and had caused massive damage. And this thing trended, and you know, it was like with DC blackout, it was quickly discovered that no chemical plant had blown up. But this was, you could see that they're kind of testing the capability to cause local panic, you know, with this technique. And so there, you know, what do you do about that? Well, you want to know what your authoritative sources of information are, and you don't want to believe things that just, you know, trend online or people are sharing on Facebook. That's, you know, without sort of some kind of authoritative validation of it, you know, it's quite possibly manipulation. As we saw during the George Floyd protests, there's a lot of that kind of stuff going around about, you know, Antifa breaking into country homes, that stuff that was just made up by, you know, by not good actors. So I'd say kind of don't believe everything you see, and try and understand where a message is coming from. You know, if it's something that's being passed along, where did that start? How was it seeded? Who started it? Was that an authoritative account or not? What we do a lot of work on at Graphika is helping to provide the context around a message. You know, so if here's a, you know, a hashtag that's trending or an image that's getting circulated, you know, how is that being promoted and boosted? You know, so if you think of that network map and that kind of cyber social training clustering, we actually have metrics on all that stuff. So you can say, oh, this hashtag, you know, it's got a high focus for, you know, the Minnesota alt-right cluster. You know, this isn't something that sort of normal people are doing. This is coming from a very specific part of the spectrum with a very specific agenda. And that helps you kind of wrap a bit of context around it to understand kind of where that, you know, who's strapped a booster rocket to it. So I'd say that in the short term, it's some of that kind of stuff, trying to, you know, evaluate whether just kind of using your own techniques or using sophisticated technology like ours, where something's coming from.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Obviously, you know, we're all living in a bit of a different world now that COVID-19 has hit, and so everybody has taken a turn into the online world, whether it's for telemedicine or learning or social media. Have you seen a major shift in any of these activities that you know you would attribute to the fact that there's a much wider audience now with people staying home and probably being on social media more than they would have been at work previously? Can you talk about kind of that, what COVID-19 has done to this space and what you've noticed? And obviously there's a lot of proliferation because we have a lot, you know, we have the federal elections and those sorts of things coming up. But, you know, have you seen over time, we've been now in lockdown since what, March of 20? So over that period of time, have just talk about what you've seen. You've obviously, you know, got way more information than the anecdotal normal person like me has. So can you just talk about the effect of COVID-19 on this?
Absolutely. So this is something that we have done and are doing a lot of work on, and it intersects with other threads of our work. And in fact, we have on our website a number of reports around this, including one called the COVID-19 infodemic, as well as reports around things like QAnon and other stuff. So if you just go to the Graphika website and look under resources, under reports, you can find a lot more detailed versions of the things I'll kind of give you cliff notes on right now. But we were really interested in COVID-19 and how information, particularly misinformation, spread about it from the very beginning. And so what we started doing were these network maps of the COVID-19 conversation broadly, and who was spreading or promoting COVID-19 disinformation going back to the beginning of 2020. And then every month we kind of do another snapshot of that and look and measure how that has changed. And what was really interesting is particularly with the spread of COVID-19 misinformation, which means, you know, information that is and misinformation, I'm saying misinformation, not disinformation, because it's a useful definitional distinction. Disinformation is information that's meant to mislead. You know, the purpose of it is to mislead. Misinformation is just misleading. It may not be intentionally misleading, right? So, so there's a difference there that matters, particularly with things like COVID-19, where people share things that they think are true, but it's just not valid science. And as often been pointed out with a new disease, that is poorly understood by the medical community. Sometimes actual doctors have the wrong idea and are spreading that idea too, which makes it the problem worse when you're looking for who to trust and you've got a bunch of stuff that's difficult to evaluate. So the short version of it is that early in the spread of COVID misinformation, it was really heavily coming from kind of the right wing, domestic and some international, but kind of the sort of far right of the political spectrum. There's a lot of communities, interrelated or woven over there, kind of at that extreme position on the ideological spectrum. And that's where a lot of this stuff was coming from. But that started to change. And what has happened in the months since is that the spread of COVID misinformation has mainstreamed. And there are a lot of different communities that carry it, and not by any means all on the political right. You've got communities of folks that are mainly interested in things like health and welfare, kind of think of your yoga blogger type that are carrying it. And another thing that's really changed is the degree to which it has become a narrative framework that has allowed previously separate conspiracy-oriented communities to start coming together and hybridizing. So you might have had conspiracy communities, lots of people like a good conspiracy theory, and you've got communities that kind of grow up around families of these conspiracy theories. Everything from the kind of the world is being controlled by some, secret cabal of bankers and governments are just a stagecraft, your typical kind of deep state conspiracy thing, to people that, anti-vaxxer type stuff that believe that, Bill Gates and others are trying to kind of control you through the dissemination of vaccines, and then other conspiracy theories around like 5G technology. So this belief that 5G towers damage human health and wildlife, and upset. There's all kinds of theories out there, which, by the way, were being actively promoted by kind of overt Russian state media like RT and Sputnik for a while. There's a great New York Times article about that. So you've got these things that different families of conspiracy thinking out there. And COVID has provided a framework within which they can all start to move in and kind of come together and start to hybridize in ways that are, I think, quite profoundly dangerous.
So John, obviously, there's so much information in this space, and there's so much, you have just a depth of knowledge in this space that is, incomparable. For a state or a local leader, however, you've referenced the reports that are on the website that people can access, but really, if somebody needs help with this or wants to get engaged to better understand, the landscape and how to use this data effectively, talk a little bit about what Graphika can offer, because I know there's a lot of people very interested out there in how they could learn more and probably do more in this space.
Sure. Well, in addition to the things, the public reports on the website, which we encourage you to go download and read, we have a technology platform, and we map out these cyber social networks around all kinds of stuff, including American cities. And then they're not just a pretty bunch of pictures. It's a live data product with all the messages flowing through that network in real time. We know what's who and what mattered to every community at every point, and hashtag whatever trends, plug it in and see who's boosting it. So from just the educational stuff on the website to the platform, there's a lot that is useful.
So if a city wants to dive in heavily with you guys, they should is there contact information on the Graphika site about your products and services, or obviously you're offering a lot out there just as open information. But are there ways for them to contact you if they're interested in learning more about how they can have a relationship with Graphika?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's different avenues available on the website, from kind of requesting a demo to downloading reports to kind of just requesting additional information. So the website's definitely a place to start.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been just incredibly informational. I think all of us now will go back and look at our social media feed a little bit differently, whether it's about an event that's going on or whether it's just about something that's coming on. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Smart Cities Global 2020, on behalf of New College Institute as a sponsor of this great conference. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to interacting with you in the future.
My pleasure. So glad you invited me. Thank you.
Stop recording.